Prepare to embark on a leisurely and refined journey through ancient Greek legends, whose echoes resonate across the ages. These stories, like soft whispers in marble halls, have been passed down from generation to generation for millennia. Allow the day's clamour to dissipate like morning mist over the Aegean Sea, and immerse yourself in this world. Now is the perfect time to dim the lights, and perhaps turn on a fan, for a gentle background hum. We'll delve into a land where gods walked among mortals, and every tale held a kernel of truth, veiled in wonder. In the rolling meadows of ancient Sicily, where wild flowers carpeted the earth like an artist's vibrant palette, lived a young woman named Persephone. Her days were spent in activities that might seem surprisingly mundane. She gathered flowers, but not with the hurried pluck of a dandelion in a yard. No, Persephone moved through these meadows like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the morning dew. She would kneel beside clusters of blooming narcissus, their white petals catching the early sunlight, and carefully select only the most perfect specimens. Her woven basket slowly filled with hyacinths, roses, and violets, which seemed to glow from within. You can almost smell the sweetness in the air, can't you? It's a blend of honey and fresh grass, the scent of a spring morning when everything feels new and full of possibility. Persephone's mother, Demeter, was the goddess of the harvest, and together they brought the world into bloom. Their lives were peaceful, predictable as the changing seasons, comforting, reliable, safe. But on that morning, as Persephone wandered further from her usual paths, something caught her eye. A solitary narcissus flower, larger and more beautiful than any she had ever seen, grew in a small clearing. Its petals seemed to shimmer like pearls, and its fragrance drew her forward, with the same pull as if someone had called her name. What Persephone didn't know, and couldn't know, was that this flower had been placed there deliberately, deep beneath the earth, in caverns so profound that sunlight never touched their walls. Hades ruled the realm of the dead. He wasn't evil, as he is sometimes depicted in stories. He was simply lonely. Imagine an eternity in a place where nothing grows, nothing changes, nothing lives. The silence would be deafening, wouldn't it? Hades had seen Persephone during his rare visits to the upper world, watched her tend to her flowers with such gentle care, and something in his ancient heart stirred. But how could the Lord of the Dead court the daughter of the harvest? How could the chasm between life and death, between sunlight and shadow, ever be bridged? As Persephone bent to pluck the magnificent narcissus, the ground beneath her began to tremble. At first it was just a low rumble, like distant thunder or a carriage passing by. But then the earth split open with a sound like a massive door creaking on ancient hinges, and from the depths rose a chariot drawn by 4 black horses, whose eyes glowed like stars. Hades himself held the reins, his dark cloak billowing behind him. With one swift motion he swept Persephone into his chariot, and before she could even cry out, they were plummeting back through the earth, the openings sealed behind them as if it had never existed. The only trace left behind were Persephone's scattered flowers and her overturned woven basket in the grass. When Demeter discovered her daughter missing, her grief was beyond compare. You know how sometimes when you're really sad you just don't want to do anything? You don't want to eat or clean or care for the things you usually care about? That's what happened to Demeter, but on a scale that affected the entire earth. She stopped tending the crops. She stopped bringing the rains. She stopped coaxing the seeds to sprout in the spring. The world began to grow cold and barren. Leaves yellowed and fell from trees, but no new ones grew. The grass withered. The flowers died. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods, began to drop their fruit before it could ripen. Meanwhile, deep in the underworld, something unexpected was happening. Persephone, after the initial shock and fear, began to notice things in her new home that surprised her. The walls of Hades' palace were encrusted with precious gems that caught and reflected light in ways that mimicked stars. Underground rivers flowed with their own music, and in gardens where the soil was rich with minerals from the earth's core, strange, beautiful flowers grew. Hades himself was not the monster she expected. He spoke softly, almost shyly. He brought her food she had never tasted, fruits that grew only in the depths of the earth, sweet and unusual. He showed her the asphodel fields where the souls of the ordinary dead wandered in peaceful dreams. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything from her, but simply hoped she might come to understand why he had brought her there. Still, Persephone missed the sun. She missed her mother. She missed the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet and the song of birds in the morning. However beautiful the underworld was, it was not home. On the surface, the situation grew desperate. Without Demeter's care, people began to starve. The other gods pleaded with her to restore the earth's fertility, but she refused. "Return my daughter to me," she said, "and the world will bloom again, but not before." Zeus, king of the gods, finally had to intervene. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, to the underworld to negotiate. Hermes found Hades sitting quietly in his garden with Persephone. Both were silent, simply existing in that strange, timeless state people are in when trying to figure out something difficult. "She must return," Hermes said softly to Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades nodded slowly. He knew this moment would come, but then looked at Persephone with eyes that held all the sorrow of the earth's depths. "I understand," he said. "But ask her, has she eaten anything while she has been here?" This was a crucial question, for there was an ancient law. Anyone who ate food in the underworld would be bound to it forever. Persephone looked at her hands. That morning, walking in Hades' garden, she had seen a pomegranate tree laden with fruit. The pomegranates were unlike anything she had ever seen, dark red, like garnets, each seed glistening like a tiny jewel. Almost without thinking, she picked one and ate 7 of its seeds. They tasted of concentrated sweetness, like the essence of all fruits ever grown. 7 seeds. Such a small thing to change the fate of a world. Because of those 7 seeds, Persephone could not return to the upper world permanently. But Hermes, who was cunning with words and negotiations, struck a compromise. For part of each year, 1 month for each seed she had eaten, Persephone would remain with Hades in the underworld. For the remaining months, she would return to her mother and the world of sunlight and growing things. And so it was decided. When Persephone returned to the surface, Demeter's joy was so immense that flowers instantly bloomed wherever her daughter's feet touched the earth. Spring burst forth like laughter, and summer followed with its abundance of growth and warmth. But when it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld, Demeter's sorrow brought autumn, when leaves changed colours and fell, and winter, when the world rested beneath blankets of snow. It is said that in the underworld, Persephone became a queen in her own right. She learned to help Hades judge the souls of the dead fairly. She tended the subterranean gardens which bloomed with flowers no living person had ever seen, and slowly she came to love this quiet, thoughtful god, who had so dramatically altered her life but treated her with such gentle respect. When spring returned each year, Persephone emerged from the earth like the flowers themselves, bringing with her the memory of the depths and the darkness that made the sunlight even more precious. And Demeter welcomed her daughter home with such joy that the entire world celebrated with blooming trees, singing birds, and the sweet scent of new grass. Even now, thousands of years later, this ancient drama still plays out in the changing seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to turn, Persephone prepares to return to her underground kingdom. Every winter, the bare branch and the dormant seed wait, like Demeter, for the return of spring. And when the first crocus pushes through the snow, it is as if Persephone herself is coming home. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other old stories might be hidden in the everyday rhythms of the world around us? What stories are the seasons themselves still telling? Speaking of stories hidden in everyday things, have you ever heard someone described as having an Achilles heel? It's a phrase used when a very strong or talented person has one small weakness. The story behind those words begins with a mother's love and a desperate attempt to protect her child from a fate she couldn't imagine. Thetis was a sea goddess, beautiful and wise, with hair that flowed like ocean waves and eyes that mirrored the depths of underwater caverns. When she married the mortal king Peleus and bore a son, she loved that child with all the fierce protectiveness mothers have felt throughout the ages. But being a goddess, Thetis could see glimpses of the future, and what she saw filled her with horror. Her son, Achilles, would grow to be the greatest warrior who ever lived. He would be swift as the wind, strong as a storm, skilled with sword and spear like no mortal. Poets would sing of his deeds for 1,000 years. But he would die young, struck down in battle while still in the prime of his youth. Imagine Thetis holding her tiny son, feeling his minuscule fingers curl around hers, watching him sleep with that perfect peace only babies possess. How could she accept that this precious child was destined for such a short, brutal life? She couldn't. She had to try and change his fate. And so, late one night, as the royal palace lay in silent slumber and even the usually talkative owls were quiet, Thetis, goddess of the sea, carefully wrapped her infant son in the softest blankets. She carried him to the shadowy banks of the river Styx. This wasn't an ordinary stream. It was the unyielding boundary between the world of the living and the grim realm of the dead. The waters of this river possessed an incredible mystical power. It was believed that anyone whose body was bathed in the Styx would become invulnerable, completely protected from all harm. The river itself was dark as a starless. Midnight, yet surprisingly warm to the touch. It flowed utterly silently like a current of liquid, palpable quiet. Thetis stepped into the water and waited patiently until it reached her waist. Then, holding her breath and whispering prayers to any gods who might hear her plea, she submerged her son into these enchanted waters. There was, however, one crucial detail to how an infant must be held. It had to be held very firmly, lest it slip from one's grasp. Thetis held little Achilles by his heel, her fingers securely wrapped around his tiny ankle. The waters of the Styx washed over every part of the child's body, save for that small patch where his mother's hand served as a shield, preventing the river from touching his skin. When she lifted him from the water, the infant Achilles was no longer entirely a mortal creature. His skin had taken on the qualities of armor, capable of deflecting any weapon. No sword could pierce it. No arrow could harm it. No spear could wound him. Thetis believed she had entirely protected her son, or so it seemed to her in that moment. Achilles grew exactly as the ancient prophecies had foretold. He was tall and powerful, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like ripe wheat fields in midsummer. His speed in a foot race surpassed horses. His endurance in battle was unrivaled by any other warrior, and his skill with a weapon was like a deadly yet graceful poetry. When he moved across the battlefield, enemies scattered before him like autumn leaves before a furious hurricane. But he was not only these things. He showed kindness to those weaker than himself, was fiercely loyal to his friends, and possessed a surprising gentleness for such a fierce fighter. Achilles played the lyre beautifully, composing songs about heroes of ages past. He felt deeply for his comrades and was not ashamed to openly mourn them when one was injured or fell in battle. In a different world, he might have been remembered as much for his compassion as for his prowess on the battlefield. When the Trojan War erupted, a conflict destined to last 10 long years, all the greatest warriors of Greece sailed across the wine-dark sea to join the fight. Achilles followed, leading his contingent of brave warriors known as the Myrmidons. Their loyalty to him was not only due to his invincibility in battle, but also because he treated them with profound respect, sharing all the hardships of the campaign. For 9 years, Achilles performed exactly as an invulnerable warrior would be expected to. He fought in countless battles, always emerging without a scratch, while enemies fell around him like wheat beneath a scythe. His reputation grew daily, until the mere mention of his name caused opposing armies to falter and waver. But then something happened that revealed another side of Achilles, the deeply feeling, deeply grieving side. His closest friend, Patroclus, was killed in battle by Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy. Patroclus was more than just a friend. He was like a brother to Achilles, the one who understood the true heart of the hero, hidden beneath all that invulnerable skin. Achilles' grief was like a force of nature. He wept so loudly that his mother heard his sobs from her undersea palace. He refused food and sleep. He cut off his beautiful golden hair and cast it onto Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, driven by a rage that was really a twisted love, he hunted down Hector and challenged him to single combat. The battle between Achilles and Hector was like a storm clashing against an unyielding mountain. Both warriors were immensely skilled. Both were fearless beyond question, but only one was protected by the waters of the Styx. Hector fought with incredible bravery, yet in the end Achilles' spear found its mark, and Troy's greatest defender fell. What Achilles did next showed both his human heart and his terrible grief. Instead of treating Hector's body with the respect due a worthy adversary, he tied it to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. It was an act of desecration that shocked both armies and drew the wrath of the gods themselves. For days Achilles continued this grim ritual, driving his chariot around the walls of Troy, while Hector's family watched in horror from the city's ramparts. It seemed that in punishing Hector's body, he was somehow trying to punish death itself for taking his friend. But in the end, Hector's father, the aged King Priam, performed an act that required more courage than any charge on a battlefield. He came alone to Achilles' tent in the dead of night, unarmed and unguarded, to beg for his son's body. The old man knelt before the warrior who had killed his child and spoke not as a king to an enemy, but as a father to another man who understood the pain of loss. "I have done what no mortal has done," Priam said softly. "I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in those words cut through Achilles' rage and grief to touch his heart. He looked at this elderly man, bowed with sorrow, and saw his own father, who would one day mourn him in the same way. Then Achilles wept, but these were not angry tears of fury, but cleansing tears of shared human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam and declared a truce, so that Troy could properly mourn its hero. It was one of Achilles' finest moments, showing that even the greatest warrior was, in the end, only human, and could be moved by compassion. The war, however, continued, and fate had not forgotten its claim on Achilles. In the final battles before the walls of Troy, as he fought with his characteristic skill and fearlessness, an arrow flew toward him. It was shot by Paris, Hector's brother, who was known more for his beauty than his bravery. Normally, such an arrow would have harmlessly bounced off Achilles' protected skin. But this arrow, guided by the god Apollo, found the single vulnerable spot on Achilles' entire body, his heel, the very place where his mother's fingers had shielded him from the waters of the Styx. It was such a tiny target, such an unlikely wound, but it was enough. The greatest warrior who ever lived fell because of his heel, the only place where a mother's protective touch had left him mortal. In trying to save her son from his destiny, Thetis had unintentionally created the very weakness that would destroy him. As he lay dying, Achilles thought not of his many victories or his eternal glory, but of simple earthly things. The feel of sunlight on his face, the infectious laughter of his friend Patroclus, the songs he never got to finish writing. He thought of his mother and hoped she would understand that he had tried to live a life that honored the gift she had given him, even if he couldn't make it as long as she wished. The story of Achilles reminds us that our greatest strengths and our deepest weaknesses often spring from the same source, the love of those who care for us. Every protection has its limits. Every gift has its price. And sometimes the very thing that makes us strong also makes us vulnerable. Even now, when we speak of someone's Achilles heel, we recall this ancient truth. Everyone, no matter how powerful they seem, has that one small place where the arrows of fate can strike. Perhaps it's not a weakness, but simply an inherent part of what makes us human. The arrows of fate that struck Achilles were not the only ones that forever changed the course of history. Sometimes love itself can be the most dangerous arrow. As a young musician named Orpheus discovered on what should have been the happiest day of his life, Orpheus possessed a gift beyond ordinary talent. When he played his lyre and sang, flowers bloomed out of season, defying the calendar. Rivers changed their courses to flow closer to his music. Wild animals sat peacefully side by side. Lions next to lambs, hawks beside mice. All listened with the same dreamy contentment one might feel when someone hums your favorite lullaby. Even ancient trees would uproot themselves and slowly lumber closer to hear him play. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing centuries-old oaks moving unhurriedly, like enormous, gentle giants, their leaves rustling in time with a distant melody. Such was the incomprehensible power of Orpheus's music. It made the impossible natural and the magical commonplace. When Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a wood nymph with eyes like spring water and a laugh like chiming bells, his song seemed to grow even more beautiful, taking on new depths and melodies. He composed tunes that captured the way sunlight played in her dark hair. He created rhythms that perfectly matched her graceful movement through the meadows, and harmonies that expressed all the wonder he felt just watching her tend to injured birds or gather wild honey. Their wedding day was perfect in a way that made you believe in the inherent goodness and harmony of the world. The ceremony took place in a grove where wild flowers grew in natural circles, as if the earth itself had decided to celebrate. Orpheus sang a song he had written just for the occasion, and as his voice rose and fell in the air, butterflies danced around the couple like living, fluttering confetti. As the wedding ceremony concluded and the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in crimson hues, the celebration slowly gave way to that blissful languor that envelops the soul after a day of perfection. Eurydice, seeking a moment of solitude, went for a walk in the meadow. She wanted to be alone, to let happiness, like sweet honey, slowly take root deep in her heart. She was stepping barefoot through the silky grass, still adorned with her wedding wreath of wild roses, when she suddenly felt a movement beneath her foot. A snake, disturbed from its twilight repose, sank its deadly fangs into her tender ankle. Eurydice only managed a piercing cry calling Orpheus's name before she fell lifelessly among the fragrant flowers that had, just moments before, witnessed her jubilation. By the time Orpheus, sensing something was wrong, reached her, she had already departed this world. Her hand retained a lingering warmth in his embrace. Her face remained serene, but the very essence of her being, her ringing laughter, her gentle teasing, her habit of humming softly when he played, all of it had melted away like ephemeral morning mist. For 7 days and 7 nights Orpheus sat inconsolably by Eurydice's lifeless body, pouring out his mournful songs. These melodies of despair were so profoundly moving that they seemed to make even the unfeeling stones weep. His music had always held undeniable power over the natural world, but now it expressed such pure and boundless pain that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of existence. Other mourners, concerned for his well-being, pleaded with him to eat, to sleep, to find some brief respite to care for himself. But Orpheus could not. How could one eat when the person who filled his life with meaning and joy no longer existed? How could one sleep when his dreams were filled with music he could never again share? Finally, a daring thought sparked in his mind, a thought so reckless and mortally dangerous that only someone maddened by unbearable grief would dare to contemplate its execution. He would journey to the very heart of the underworld and persuade Hades, its lord, to return Eurydice. No mortal had ever yet managed to enter the abode of the deceased and return unharmed. But Orpheus had his music, and music, he believed, was capable of true miracles. The entrance to the underworld lay hidden in the depths of a cave, so profound that the sun's rays never penetrated its innermost recesses. As Orpheus descended into this gloom, drawing melodies from his lyre to guide his way, the usual noises and moans of the underworld gradually faded. The agonizing cries of the condemned, the ominous roar of the river Styx, the creak of colossal gates, all fell silent, listening to his song. Even Cerberus, the fierce three-headed hound that ceaselessly guarded the gates to the realm of the dead, lay down and let out a soft, mournful whimper as Orpheus played. The monster's three sets of eyes, which usually burned with unquenchable vigilance, dimmed as if belonging to a sleeping puppy. When Orpheus finally appeared before the majestic thrones of Hades and Persephone, he performed the most intimate and significant song of his existence. He sang of a love that transcended the boundary of death, of the agonizing pain of separation, of a desolate world that had lost its harmony when Eurydice was taken from him. His song was so divinely beautiful, so filled with genuine grief and boundless love, that for the first time in countless eons, Lord Hades shed tears. Even the Furies, those formidable goddesses of vengeance whose hearts were believed to be harder than granite itself, felt tears stream down their cheeks, tears they could not remember ever shedding. Persephone, who understood more deeply than anyone what it meant to be forcibly torn from the world of the living, leaned towards her husband and gently whispered something in his ear. Hades slowly bowed his head, wiping away his tears with the back of his hand, like any mortal swayed by emotion. "Your music has touched our hearts," Hades declared, his voice softened, imbued with unexpected compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you, but there is one inviolable condition. You must exit the underworld ahead of her, and you must not, under any circumstances, look back until you both have reached the sunlit upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before then, she will vanish from you forever." This condition seemed entirely feasible to Orpheus. He had managed to find his way into the underworld. Surely he could find his way back out. He nodded readily, already anticipating the moment when he and Eurydice would emerge into the light of day and be reunited to live their lives together once more. The journey back was marked by anticipation. Behind him, Orpheus heard Eurydice's familiar footsteps, her gentle breathing, the faint rustle of her wedding dress against the uneven stone. Sometimes she would hum almost inaudibly along with the songs he played to light their way, and that sound surpassed in sweetness any melody he had ever heard. But as they ascended higher, and the path grew more winding and steep, a nagging doubt began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him sounded so uncertain. What if he was only imagining them in his tormented mind? What if Hades had cunningly deceived him, and he was ascending alone while Eurydice remained a prisoner below? What if she was struggling to keep up, faltering, falling behind? The closer they drew to the surface, the more these anxieties overwhelmed him. He began to walk more slowly, straining to hear every slightest sign that she was still there. Once, when a section of the path was particularly treacherous, he heard her stumble ever so slightly, and he had to grip the neck of his lyre tightly to resist the urge to turn and help her. Finally, after what felt like endless hours of ascent, Orpheus saw something that made his heart leap with sudden joy. Ahead, a faint strip of golden sunlight appeared, marking the cave's exit. They were on the threshold of freedom. Just a few more steps, and they would both reclaim the world of the living. But as he approached this strip of light, his gnawing doubts reached their peak. The footsteps behind him had grown so faint he could barely discern them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the shadowy realm behind them? What if she needed his support to cross this final barrier? The instant his feet felt the touch of life-giving sunlight, just one single step before Eurydice would have been safely out, Orpheus sharply turned around. For one perfect, profoundly poignant moment he saw her. She was there, as beautiful as ever, reaching out towards the light and towards him. But she was still one step inside the fatal boundary of the underworld. And by looking back, Orpheus had violated the sacred condition of her release. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered. Her voice was filled with deep sorrow, but devoid of any anger. She understood that his action was driven by immense love, not distrust. But understanding could not change the irreversible consequences. She melted away like morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply dissolved, returning to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus sealed itself, like water closing over a stone. Orpheus dedicated the remainder of his days to composing melodies imbued with themes of love and loss, the fathomless chasm between bright hope and deepest despair. His music became even more sublime than before, yet it also grew sadder, for it carried the bitter knowledge that some mistakes cannot be redeemed, and some opportunities are irrevocably lost. He no longer attempted to return to the underworld. Perhaps he understood that Hades' favor could not be sought twice. Or perhaps he realized that some sorrows must simply be endured, transformed into something else through the alchemy of time and acceptance. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as a reminder that love sometimes demands the impossible from us, to move forward without looking back, to trust what is hidden from our eyes, to believe in promises that seem too incredible to be true. And sometimes, even when humans fail these impossible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of melody that continues to echo in the world long after they are gone. Sometimes the echoes of ancient narratives reach our present day in the most unpredictable ways. Just as Orpheus's melodies continued to resonate after his demise, so too has the faint whisper of a magnificent city, believed to have sunk beneath the ocean waves long before the dawn of written civilization, persisted. The philosopher Plato first shared the story of Atlantis with the world in his philosophical treatises, portraying it as a civilization that flourished 9,000 years before his own era. Whether it was historical reality or a philosophical experiment on the rise and fall of civilizations, humanity will likely never fully comprehend. However, the story he told was so vivid, so rich in detail, that people have tirelessly sought Atlantis ever since. According to Plato, Atlantis was located on an island beyond the legendary Pillars of Hercules, in the region now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. The island's area surpassed the combined territories of Libya and Asia. It was structured as a series of concentric rings, where land rings alternated with water channels, like a grandiose target carved from earth and sea. At the center of these circles stood the most magnificent city imaginable. Buildings were constructed from black, white and red stone quarried directly on the island, and many were faced with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which emitted a warm, golden glow. The palace at the city's heart was a marvel of engineering genius and artistic skill. Its walls were inlaid with silver, and its spires gleamed with gold. Within its depths lay the temple of Poseidon, the sea deity who, according to legend, was the progenitor of the first Atlantean king. The temple's facade was entirely covered in silver, save for its spires, which sparkled with gold, and inside stood a colossal statue of Poseidon, driving 6 winged horses, so tall that his head nearly touched the immense hall's ceiling. Even more striking than the city's visual splendor, however, was its unprecedented sophistication. The Atlanteans developed an intricate system of hot and cold thermal springs that supplied water for magnificent public baths. They constructed harbors capable of accommodating seagoing vessels from all corners of the then-known world. They achieved such a level of agricultural development that their island yielded 2 harvests annually. The inhabitants of Atlantis traced their lineage directly from Poseidon, and for many generations they retained a spark of divine nature within them. They were characterized by wisdom, justice, and moderation in their pursuits. They valued virtue above wealth, and wisdom above power. Their laws were inscribed on orichalcum columns, and their kings convened alternately every 5th and 6th year to discuss affairs of state and ensure the triumph of justice throughout their vast kingdom. For countless centuries, Atlantis flourished under this unique system of governance. Its majestic ships traversed the boundless oceans, reaching the most distant shores, bringing back invaluable knowledge and exotic goods, while generously sharing their own revolutionary discoveries with the world. The Atlanteans were unparalleled masters in the sciences, unraveling mysteries that other civilizations at the time dared not even dream of. They understood the celestial mechanics of stellar motion with astonishing precision, possessed thorough knowledge of the properties of various metals, and mastered the art of cultivating plants in conditions that seemed utterly impossible to other peoples. However, with the passage of time, subtle yet profound changes began to occur within the very essence of the Atlanteans. The divine spark, bequeathed to them by Poseidon, gradually dimmed with each new generation, weakened by both intermarriage with mortals and, perhaps, the corrupting influence of excessive prosperity and unprecedented affluence. Where they once found contentment in abundance, now their hearts were consumed by an insatiable craving for excess. Where they once highly valued wisdom, now only cunning was revered. Where they once showed generosity towards foreigners and neighbors, now they were gripped by avarice and a drive for territorial domination. This transformation was as subtle as it was inevitable. It unfolded with the slowness of a sunset, where the light changes so gradually that one might not notice the shift until suddenly realizing the world around has completely transformed. The Atlanteans began to look beyond their fertile island, seeing neighboring lands not as potential friends and trading partners, but merely as territories to be conquered and peoples destined for subjugation. They amassed colossal military might and moved westward to conquer the Mediterranean. Their advanced technologies and impeccably coordinated tactics made them virtually invincible. One after another, ancient cities and kingdoms fell before their relentless onslaught. But when they reached Athens, the city destined to be Plato's birthplace, they met with utterly unexpected and fierce resistance. The ancient Athenians, despite being vastly outnumbered and technologically outmatched, fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and the righteous determination of those who refused to bow to tyranny. Against all odds, Athens not only successfully repelled the Atlantean aggression, but launched a swift counterattack that drove the would-be conquerors back across the sea. It seemed that the courage and virtue lost by the Atlanteans had somehow taken root in Athenian soil. However, the true judgment upon Atlantis came not from mortal enemies, but from the gods themselves. Zeus, observing from the heights of Olympus, saw what the once noble Atlanteans had become, a civilization consumed by greed, aggression, and moral decay. He delivered a harsh verdict deciding that such a society had forfeited its right to exist. The end came in a single day and night. Earthquakes shook the island with such furious intensity that monumental structures crumbled like card houses. Volcanic eruptions filled the air with thick ash and fiery flashes. But most devastating was that the sea itself rose, swallowing the land. The concentric circles that had once been Atlantis's glory transformed into gigantic whirlpools that mercilessly dragged ships, buildings, and people into the abyss. The magnificent palace, the sacred temple of Poseidon, the vast libraries holding accumulated wisdom, the harbours that once welcomed vessels from across the world, all vanished irrevocably beneath the waves, which closed over the island like a book being shut. When morning came, only empty ocean remained where a great civilization had once stood. The sea in that region became utterly unnavigable, choked with thick mud churned up from the bottom. Ships that dared to enter those waters became stuck in what felt like liquid earth, and sailors reported that the area remained impassable for generations. The story of Atlantis might well have ended there, forgotten like many other tales of divine wrath and human folly. Yet something about this legend captured the human imagination with a power that purely historical accounts of ruined cities never could. Perhaps it was the astonishing idea that such an advanced civilization could simply vanish overnight. Perhaps it was the tantalizing possibility that somewhere beneath the ocean waves, the ruins of this magnificent city still lay, waiting to be discovered. For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters, and dreamers have tirelessly searched for Atlantis in the most diverse corners of the world, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, from the Caribbean to icy Antarctica. Some claim to have found evidence in underwater formations off the coast of Bimini. Others suggested that Atlantis is merely an echo of memories of Minoan Crete, destroyed by a volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. But perhaps the exact location is not fundamentally important. Perhaps Atlantis exists not as a specific place that can be found with ships and diving equipment, but as an eternal idea that resurfaces again and again in the human consciousness. It is the idea of a perfect society that destroyed itself through its own success, a civilization that reached such heights that it forgot the values that originally led it to greatness. Every time a society becomes too arrogant, too confident in its superiority, too ready to impose its will on others by force, the ghost of Atlantis whispers a warning. Every time we observe technology and prosperity without wisdom and restraint, we encounter the conditions that are believed to have led to the downfall of the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. Perhaps this is why people continue to search for Atlantis, not only in the depths of the ocean, but in the rises and falls of civilizations throughout history. We continue to search for it because we continue to create it, and we constantly need to be reminded that the price of greatness is humility, to remember where we came from and why we started this journey in the first place. The journey to find lost greatness often demands more courage than wisdom. This is what a young prince named Jason discovered when he set out for a treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His arduous quest was to lead him to the very edge of the known world, accompanied by heroes whose names still echo through the corridors of legend. Jason's story began with a family betrayal, as is often the case in many ancient tales. His uncle Peleus treacherously usurped the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father, and when Jason came of age, he returned to reclaim his rightful inheritance. But Peleus, as cunning as he was cruel, made Jason an offer that seemed magnanimous but was, in fact, meticulously planned to get rid of him forever. I will gladly give you the throne, Peleus said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But first you must prove your valor by performing a great deed. Bring me the golden fleece from Colchis, and the kingdom will be yours. The golden fleece belonged to a wondrous ram that had once saved 2 children on its back, soaring through the air with the lightness of a bird. When this ram was sacrificed to the gods, its shining fleece, gleaming like the sun itself, was hung in a sacred grove in the distant kingdom of Colchis, located on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. However, the fleece did not simply rest there, waiting to be plucked like ripe fruit from a tree. It was guarded ceaselessly by a dragon that never slept, never closed its eyes, never for a moment relaxed its vigilance. This was not the kind of dragon one might encounter in a children's story, enormous, fire-breathing, and dramatic in its threat. This dragon was far more terrifying, for it possessed incredible patience, keen intelligence, and absolute devotion to its task. The creature coiled itself around the oak tree from whose branches the fleece hung, its scales changing colour with the light, sometimes glinting golden like the fleece itself, sometimes darkening like the shadows between the leaves. Its eyes, like polished amber, tracked every movement in the grove with the focused attention of a predator that had all the time in the world. To reach Colchis, Jason needed not just a ship, but a crew brave enough to venture into uncharted waters, filled with monsters, hostile tribes, and navigational hazards that had doomed countless vessels before them. So he commissioned the construction of a ship named the Argo, and called upon heroes to join him on what everyone understood would most likely be a one-way voyage. The response was truly astonishing. Heroes from all corners of Greece flocked to join those who would soon be known as the Argonauts. Among them was Heracles, the strongest of all mortals, capable of wrestling lions and diverting rivers. There was Orpheus, whose enchanting music could captivate wild beasts and make stones weep. Present were the twins Castor and Pollux, skilled in horsemanship and boxing, and Atalanta, an unrivaled huntress who could outrun any man and whose arrows never missed their mark. Each hero had their own reasons for participating in this grand adventure. Some sought immortal glory, others the thrill of it. Some were fleeing difficult situations at home, others yearned for dreams they couldn't quite articulate. But all understood that this journey would be a trial unlike any they had ever known. The journey to Colchis stretched over many months, each part of it a separate, thrilling adventure. They passed Scylla and Charybdis, colossal boulders that periodically clashed together, crushing any ship unlucky enough to be caught between them. They encountered the Harpies, vicious creatures with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, who tormented a wise old king by constantly stealing his food. They landed on islands where the locals had never seen foreigners before, and they had to use diplomacy as often as force to continue their journey. Sometimes the locals were hostile, sometimes they proved helpful, but always they displayed a genuine curiosity about these heroes who had come so far from home on such a dangerous mission. The quiet perfection of the impossible and the price of redemption. When the legendary ship Argo finally reached the shores of Colchis, King Aetes received Jason and his valiant crew with that characteristic monarchical wary courtesy. Such an attitude is typically extended to guests who might prove to be either valuable allies or potentially dangerous adversaries. The ruler of Colchis expressed his willingness to hand over the coveted golden fleece to Jason, but only on the condition that he complete a series of seemingly impossible tasks. First, the hero had to tame 2 bronze bulls whose breath spewed fire and whose hooves were made of copper. Then, using these fire-breathing creatures, he was to plough a field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth, armed warriors were to spring forth, whom Jason was obligated to defeat before the sun set. This trial, as everyone well understood, was designed as a death trap. The bronze bulls had already trampled and burned all previous challengers who dared to defy them. The warriors born from the dragon's teeth were fierce, flawlessly coordinated, and utterly merciless. It was assumed that no mortal could survive such tests. However, Jason found an unexpected ally in Medea, the king's daughter, who possessed deep knowledge of magic and herbs. She had watched Jason carefully since his arrival in Colchis, and something in his fearlessness and evident dedication to his mission touched her heart. Medea was far from an ordinary princess passively awaiting rescue. She was shrewd, powerful, and aware of forces most people dared not even contemplate. Her magic could both heal and harm, protect or destroy, and she decided to use it to aid this foreign prince who had travelled so far for what everyone considered impossible. She gave Jason a magical ointment that would protect him from the bull's fiery breath and copper hooves. She revealed to him the secret of defeating the warriors springing from the dragon's teeth. He was to throw a stone into their midst, causing them to fight each other rather than him. And most importantly, she promised to help him get past the sleepless dragon that guarded the golden fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had foretold. Protected by her wondrous ointment, Jason managed to yoke the bronze bulls and plough the field. When armed warriors rose from the furrows, he threw a stone into their ranks, and they immediately began to fight each other with such unrestrained fury that they utterly destroyed themselves. King Aeetes was furious at Jason's success. However, he could not break his public promise. Nevertheless, he had no intention of actually giving up the Golden Fleece. He began to devise treacherous plans for a nighttime attack on the Argonauts, intending to kill them all while they slept. Medea, who understood her father's thoughts better than anyone, warned Jason of the impending betrayal. That same night, she led him to the sacred grove where the Golden Fleece hung on an oak tree, guarded by the dragon that never knew sleep. The dragon sensed their approach long before they reached the tree. Its massive head rose from its coiled body, and its amber eyes fixed on them with malevolent intelligence. It made no sound. It did not roar or hiss like less powerful creatures. Its threat lay in its absolute stillness, in its patient readiness for a lightning-fast strike. Then Medea sang a song in a language older than Greek, perhaps older than any human tongue. It was a lullaby that appealed to the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, the parts that remembered what it felt like to be small and safe, cradled in loving arms. The dragon's head began to sway slightly as if it were fighting something it had never experienced before. Its amber eyes, which had never closed, began to grow heavy. The coiled rings of its body loosened as muscles that had been tense for decades finally began to relax. For the first time in its long existence, the sleepless dragon began to sleep. Jason climbed the oak tree as quietly as possible, barely daring to breathe as he reached for the Golden Fleece. When his fingers touched it, the fleece was warm, as if it still carried the life of the magical ram from which it came. It was surprisingly light and seemed to glow with an inner radiance. With the fleece securely tucked under his arm, Jason descended and followed Medea out of the grove. Behind them, the dragon continued to sleep, lost in dreams no creature before it had ever known. The journey home was as perilous as the journey there, now complicated by the fact that King Aeetes had sent pursuit ships to reclaim his daughter and kill the thieves of his treasure. But that is another story entirely, full of its own adventures and heartbreaks. What matters now is that Jason accomplished what everyone thought impossible. He obtained the Golden Fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that never rested, never relaxed its vigilance, never gave anyone the slightest opportunity to approach. Sometimes the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by force or cunning, but by offering it something it has never had. In this case, the simple gift of sleep. The rest that every living creature needs, but which this dragon was denied by the nature of its duty. It makes you wonder what other seemingly impossible tasks can be achieved, not by fighting harder or being smarter, but by understanding what the guardian truly needs and finding a way to provide it. Understanding what drives us to attempt impossible tasks, Heracles knew better than anyone, though his understanding came at a cost that nearly destroyed him. His story reminds us that sometimes our greatest strengths and our deepest flaws spring from the same source, and that redemption often requires us to do far more than we think we can bear. Heracles was born with a strength surpassing anything possible for a mortal. As an infant, he strangled 2 snakes, sent to kill him in his cradle, and he did so laughing, as if it were a game. As he grew, his strength grew with him, until he could lift boulders that would challenge a dozen ordinary men. He could wrestle lions bare-handed, could bend iron bars as easily as one might bend a flower stem. But along with this immense physical power came a temper that was equally potent and far more dangerous. When Heracles grew angry, he didn't just raise his voice or storm out of a room as most people do. His fury was like a force of nature, sudden, overwhelming, and destructive beyond measure. For many years, Heracles managed this aspect of his nature. He married a woman named Megara, and they had children. It seemed he had found the peaceful domestic life that might tame the wildness in his heart. He was a loving father, gentle with his children despite his immense strength, and a devoted husband who strove each day to be worthy of his family's trust. But the goddess Hera, who hated Heracles from birth because he was the son of her husband Zeus by another woman, decided to destroy this happiness in the cruelest way. She afflicted Heracles with a fit of madness, a rage so complete that he lost all sense of who he was and what he was doing. When the madness finally receded, Heracles found himself surrounded by a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his insane fury, he had killed his own wife and children, the very people he loved most in the world. His strength, which was meant to protect them, had become the instrument of their destruction. The grief and guilt that followed almost completely consumed him. For days he sat amidst the ruins of his former happiness, unable to eat, sleep, or even speak. How does one live with the knowledge that you have destroyed everything you ever held dear? How does one continue to exist when the thing you feared most about yourself proved to be absolutely true? Finally, desperately seeking a way to atone for his deeds, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's prophecy was harsh but offered a thread of hope. Heracles was to serve his cowardly cousin, King Eurystheus, for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king demanded. Only by completing this service could he find purification for his terrible crime. King Eurystheus was precisely the kind of man one might expect to be given authority over a hero like Heracles. Petty, envious and cruel. He was also clever enough to understand that Heracles' strength made him dangerous, and cowardly enough to wish for that strength's destruction rather than its use for any beneficial purpose. Therefore Eurystheus devised a series of 12 labours. Each one was designed to be impossible. Each one was intended to kill Heracles in some terrible way. If the hero somehow survived one task, the next was even deadlier. The first labour was to slay the Nemean lion, a creature with a hide so thick no weapon could pierce it. Arrows bounced off it like pebbles, swords shattered against its fur, spears splintered on impact. Heracles eventually had to strangle the beast with his bare hands, a struggle that lasted an entire day and left him exhausted but victorious. The second labour was to destroy the Lernaean Hydra, a serpentine monster with multiple heads that grew back twice as many when one was severed. Each time Heracles cut off a head with his sword, 2 new ones sprouted in its place, until he was facing a writhing mass of snapping jaws and venomous fangs. He solved this problem by having his nephew cauterize each severed stump with a torch immediately after Heracles cut off a head, preventing new growth. It was one of the few times Heracles accepted help during his labours, and it taught him that sometimes strength alone is not enough. Wisdom and cooperation are also needed. His third labour directed the hero into the mountain ranges, where he was tasked with capturing the Ceryneian hind, a sacred creature dedicated to the goddess Artemis herself. This assignment required of Heracles not so much physical might as exceptional patience and considerable endurance, for he had to relentlessly pursue this extraordinarily swift animal for an entire year. The culmination of the chase involved capturing it alive without causing any harm, which of course made an already difficult mission exponentially more complicated. Each subsequent labour imposed upon Heracles presented a new trial, designed to test different facets of his multifaceted character. Thus, he was required to capture the gigantic Erymanthian boar alive. This was followed by the task of cleaning the famous Augean stables, which housed countless herds of livestock and had remained in a state of complete filth for centuries. He was also called upon to drive away the bloodthirsty Stymphalian birds, which threatened the surrounding lands. No less dangerous was the taming of Diomedes' fire-breathing Mars. And of course he was to acquire the girdle of Hippolyta, the valiant queen of the warlike Amazons. Notably, some of these assignments demanded that Heracles develop subtle diplomatic skills, entirely new to him. Others required the exercise of cunning and careful planning, rather than simply brute physical force. The hero, who at the beginning of his journey relied entirely on his immense strength, gradually mastered the art of using his mind, his intuition, and his ability to interact with others. However, the truly grand and most grueling trials still lay ahead for the hero. The 10th mission required him to steal the cattle of Geryon, a monstrous 3-headed giant who dwelled on the westernmost fringes of the then-known world. To reach the island where Geryon's cattle grazed, Heracles had to undertake a perilous sea voyage across the boundless expanse of the ocean. It was during this journey that he erected the so-called Pillars of Hercules, which are known today as the Strait of Gibraltar, thereby marking the extreme western point to which human knowledge of the world extended. The 11th labour then directed him to the mysterious Garden of the Hesperides, where golden apples grew, granting eternal life to anyone who tasted them. These precious fruits were guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, beautiful nymphs whose singing accompanied the tending of the trees, but also by a 100-headed dragon named Ladon. To successfully complete this extremely difficult assignment, Heracles had to resort to cunning and persuade the mighty Titan Atlas to assist him. Atlas, who bore the celestial vault on his shoulders as punishment for participating in an ancient rebellion against the Olympian gods, agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would temporarily take on his unbearable burden. Thus, for a brief moment, Heracles found himself at the edge of the world, feeling the entire weight of the heavens on his shoulders, and in that moment, he grasped the true meaning of responsibility that could not be deferred or shifted to another. The 12th and final labour surpassed all previous ones in its apparent impossibility. The hero was to descend into the gloomy realm of the dead to bring forth Cerberus, the fierce 3-headed dog, the unceasing guardian of Hades' gates. Before Heracles, no mortal had ever managed to enter the abode of the Lord of the Underworld and return alive. Cerberus, in turn, had never been defeated by any hero, nor even the most formidable monster. By this point, however, Heracles was no longer the unrestrained, rage-filled man who had embarked on his redemptive deeds 12 years prior. He had undergone profound internal changes. He had learned patience by relentlessly pursuing the Ceryneian hind. He had mastered the subtleties of diplomacy through negotiations with the warlike Amazons. And true humility had come to him when he supported the celestial vault on his shoulders. Therefore, when he appeared before Hades and Persephone, asking for permission to attempt to tame Cerberus, his address was filled not with arrogance, but with the deepest respect. The lord of the underworld, Hades, agreed to grant him this opportunity, but with one indispensable condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus using only his own strength, without any weapons and without anyone's outside help. This became the culminating test of everything he had learned and developed over his long years of service. The contest between Heracles and Cerberus, contrary to expectations, proved to be less noisy and dramatic than it was epic in its astonishing silence. There was no deafening roaring, no theatrical posturing, only the tenacious opposition of strength against strength, endurance against endurance. Heracles gripped the colossal dog's powerful necks tightly and held him, regardless of how furiously the creature thrashed, trying to free itself, and how desperately it tried to throw off its opponent. In the end, Cerberus seemed to realize that this man would not release him from his embrace, would not back down, would not be intimidated, and would not exhaust himself. And then, with a semblance of respect that could be attributed even to a guardian of the underworld, he allowed himself to be led into the world of the living. When Heracles appeared before King Eurystheus, presenting him with the 3-headed monster, the cowardly ruler, overcome with panic at the mere sight of the beast, immediately granted Heracles his long-awaited freedom. Thus the 12 heroic labours were completed. The debt of atonement had been fully paid, and the hero finally gained the right to live his own life, freed from the burden of previous obligations. However, there is something special about tasks that possess the power to transform a person. Having completed them, an individual is never again the same person who began that journey. Heracles, having finished his 12 labours, was a completely different man compared to the one who had embarked on them 12 years prior, consumed by grief and guilt. He had grasped a profound truth true power stems not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to understand when to refrain from using one's strength. He discovered that the fiercest battles are often fought not against external monsters, but against those aspects of oneself that are least likable. And he came to understand that redemption is not an endpoint one reaches, but a continuous path, a daily choice to use one's talents and gifts for the benefit of something far greater than one's own existence. The 12 labors of Heracles serve as a vivid reminder that sometimes the very trials that seem designed to break us are, in fact, the lessons that open our eyes to who we truly are and who we are capable of becoming. As for who a person is capable of becoming, Sisyphus, in his own deep conviction, had long since provided a definitive answer. He was firmly confident in his exceptional intellect, believing it allowed him to outsmart anyone, including even the almighty Olympian gods. The story of Sisyphus serves as a stark reminder that there are contests where victory is undesirable and triumphs that ultimately prove to be merely disguised defeats. Sisyphus was the ruler of Corinth, and his name was known throughout Hellas for his outstanding cunning and sharp mind. He not only founded his city but also brought it to prosperity, skillfully combining strategic thinking with ruthless pragmatism. He represented the type of ruler who always seemed several steps ahead of everyone else, capable of discovering an advantageous approach or a hidden benefit in any, even the most complex, situation. However, Sisyphus had one fatal flaw. He simply could not resist the temptation to demonstrate his shrewdness, even when common sense suggested it would be better to remain silent and keep his clever plans to himself. In this he was like a grand chess master who couldn't help but explain every brilliant move to his opponent, thereby inadvertently revealing his own strategy. The beginning of his misfortunes was set in motion when Sisyphus inadvertently witnessed an event he absolutely should not have seen. Zeus, the almighty king of the Olympian gods, having transformed into a majestic eagle, abducted a beautiful river nymph named Aegina. Her father, the river god Asopus, overcome with grief, searched everywhere for his vanished daughter and, in desperation, turned to Sisyphus for help. In such a situation, the most prudent course of action for a mortal king would have been to feign complete ignorance. After all, what sane ruler would dare interfere in disputes between gods? However, Sisyphus saw this not only as an opportunity to gain a powerful ally, but also as a chance to demonstrate his knowledge, a chance he could not refuse. "I saw what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus declared to Asopus. "She was taken by Zeus himself, but if you wish to obtain this information, I will require something in return. Create a spring of pure fresh water for my city, and I will tell you where he carried her off." This deal seemed absolutely brilliant to him. Asopus, having received what he desired, fulfilled his part of the bargain by creating a life-giving spring. Sisyphus, in turn, revealed Zeus's secret, and Corinth consequently gained an invaluable water resource. But in his overconfidence, Sisyphus made a classic mistake, naively believing that he could manipulate forces immeasurably greater than his own with impunity. Zeus, of course, was greatly angered to discover that a mere mortal king had not only betrayed his secret, but had also set an enraged river god upon him. The Lord of Olympus decided that Sisyphus needed to be taught a harsh lesson regarding the dangers of excessive cleverness that turns to one's own detriment. So Zeus sent death itself with the task of taking Sisyphus and escorting him to the underworld. However, even in the face of the ultimate and inevitable fate awaiting all mortals, Sisyphus could not resist trying to outwit his adversary. When death appeared in the palace in Corinth, Sisyphus met her with feigned humility. "I suppose my time has come," he said sadly. "I am ready to follow you. But could you tell me about these chains you carry? How exactly do they function? I've heard they're indestructible, but I've never seen them up close." Death, who was quite proud of her fearsome equipment, readily began to demonstrate it. "You see, once these chains are locked, no force in the entire universe can break them. Here, let me show you how they fasten." And faster than Death could react, Sisyphus cleverly snapped the chains around Death herself. From the moment Death became a prisoner in her own unbreakable shackles, no one anywhere could die any more. This became the greatest violation of the natural order of the world. At first, Sisyphus was in a state of euphoria over his own incredible cunning. He had managed to deceive Death itself, to accomplish what no mortal before him had achieved. However, the horrifying consequences of his audacious act gradually began to manifest with undeniable clarity. Without Death to take the old and infirm, as well as those suffering from illness, the world plunged into boundless torment. People who, by the natural course of things, should have found peace in oblivion, were condemned to drag out a miserable existence in unending pain and helplessness. Warriors who fell on battlefields could not truly die. They remained lying on the ground, terribly wounded, unable to heal or find long-awaited relief. The gods were not merely indignant, they were deeply concerned. For the entire cosmic order of the universe depended on the sacred cycle of life and death. Without Death, tasked with balancing life, the very existence of the universe was threatened. In the end, Ares himself, the formidable god of war, came to Corinth to put an end to this chaos. He freed Death from her shackles and personally escorted Sisyphus to the gloomy realm of the underworld. However, even then, Sisyphus had one more, no less sophisticated, trick up his sleeve. Before departing for the world of the dead, he had pre-instructed his wife not to perform the customary funeral rites for him. Upon arriving in the abode of the dead, he immediately complained to Hades about the egregious violation of religious law. "My wife has disgraced me," Sisyphus indignantly declared. "She did not arrange a proper funeral for me, and of course you cannot expect me to remain in the underworld if I was not sent here properly, in full accordance with ancient traditions." Hades, who was known for his meticulous adherence to all procedures, agreed that this was indeed a serious problem. He granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living for precisely as long as it would take to arrange a fitting funeral. But as soon as Sisyphus found himself back in Corinth, he had no intention of voluntarily returning to the underworld. He lived many more years, enjoying earthly life and ceaselessly boasting about how he had managed to outsmart Death, not once, but twice. In the end, of course, old age caught up with him, and when he died a natural death, there was no escaping his fate. But by then, the gods had decided that an ordinary punishment was not sufficient for one who had caused so much trouble and shown such contempt for the natural order. Sisyphus was condemned to a special form of eternal punishment. He was given an everlasting task, to push a massive boulder up a hill. The crux of it was that each time he neared the summit, the stone would roll back down, and he would have to start all over again. Imagine it. Sisyphus braces his shoulder against the huge rock, feeling its weight and rough texture, beginning the slow, grueling ascent of the mountainside. His muscles strain, His breath comes in ragged gasps. Sweat stings his eyes. Step by step, inch by inch, he pushes the boulder higher up the slope. As he climbs, he sees the hilltop drawing closer. His heart begins to hope that this time it will be different. That this time he truly will manage to push the stone to the top. He pushes harder, ignoring the ache in his back and shoulders, focusing all his energy on those last few feet. And then, just as he is about to succeed, the boulder breaks free from his control and rolls back down. Sisyphus must watch his progress vanish. He must accept that all his effort was for naught. He must begin the entire process anew. The punishment was perfectly tailored to Sisyphus's character. He had always been driven by a desire to win, to be cleverer than everyone else, to accomplish what others could not. Now he was trapped in a task where victory was impossible, where cunning was useless, where his intellect afforded him no advantage. But this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. After countless ages of pushing his boulder, something in Sisyphus changed. He began to find a strange semblance of peace in the repetition, a rhythm that was almost meditative. He started to notice things he had never paid attention to before. How the light shifted on the mountainside throughout the day, the tiny wildflowers that grew between the stones, the feel of his muscles working in concert to move the massive rock. He began to take pride not in reaching the summit, which he knew was impossible, but in the quality of his effort, the resilience of his resolve. Some philosophers have suggested that in his eternal task, Sisyphus discovered something that had eluded him in his cunning, scheming life. The satisfaction that comes not from outwitting others or achieving impossible victories, but from simply doing one's work with dignity and perseverance, regardless of the outcome. Or perhaps the punishment gradually transformed into a kind of gift, a chance to discover that even in the most hopeless situation, one can find purpose and even contentment. The myth of Sisyphus reminds us that sometimes the very qualities we think make us superior, our cleverness, our ability to find loopholes and shortcuts, our determination to win at all costs, can become the sources of our greatest suffering. And sometimes the tasks that seem most meaningless are the ones that teach us the most about what truly matters. We all have our boulders to push, our hills to climb, our tasks that seem to restart just when we think we're making progress. The question is not whether we will succeed in the way we originally hoped, but whether we will find a way to push our stone with dignity, purpose, and perhaps even joy. Finding joy in impossible circumstances is something Daedalus understood better than most. Though his story shows us that sometimes the very solutions we create to escape our problems can become the source of even greater tragedy, his narrative is a tale of genius and love, innovation and loss, and the terrible weight of unintended consequences. Daedalus was the greatest inventor and craftsman who ever lived. His hands could shape any material into any form he could imagine, and his imagination seemed to know no bounds. He built mechanical servants that could perform complex tasks, fountains that played music as water flowed through them, and sculptures so lifelike that people would speak to them, expecting a reply. His workshop was a marvel of unfinished projects and brilliant innovations. Gears and pulleys hung from the ceiling next to sketches of flying machines. Workbenches were cluttered with models of buildings that defied traditional architecture, devices that could measure time or predict the weather, toys that moved on their own as if they were alive. But Daedalus's greatest creation was not a machine or a building. It was his son, Icarus. Not literally created, of course, but shaped and taught through years of patient instruction and gentle guidance. Icarus possessed his father's curiosity and sharp mind, though he lacked the patience and wisdom that came with an older man's experience. You can imagine them working together in the workshop, Daedalus showing his son how to join pieces of wood so they would never come apart, how to temper metal until it reached the perfect sharpness, how to observe the flight of birds and understand the principles that kept them aloft. Icarus listened intently, his young face serious with concentration, asking endless questions about why things worked the way they did. Their peaceful life was disrupted when King Minos of Crete summoned Daedalus to his court. The king had a problem. His wife had given birth to a monster called the Minotaur, half man and half bull, and he needed a place to keep it confined. Not to kill it, mind you, but to imprison it in such a way that it would not terrorize his people, yet still be able to live. Daedalus designed and built the labyrinth, a maze so complex and bewildering that anyone who entered it would become hopelessly lost. Passages twisted and turned back on themselves, led to dead ends, opened into chambers that seemed to offer an exit, but actually led deeper into the maze. In its center, the Minotaur lived in a kind of peaceful captivity, fed and cared for, but utterly unable to find its way out. The labyrinth was a masterpiece of engineering and psychology, accounting not only for the physical challenge of navigation, but also the mental effects of prolonged confusion and disorientation. It was designed not just to be impassable, but to ensure that anyone who entered it would gradually lose all hope of ever gaining freedom. For several years, Daedalus and Icarus lived comfortably on Crete. As honored guests of King Minos, Daedalus continued his work, creating new inventions and solving complex problems for the royal court. Icarus grew from a boy into a young man, mastering his father's skills and developing his own interests and talents. But then something happened that changed everything. The hero Theseus arrived on Crete and, with the help of the king's daughter Ariadne, managed to navigate the labyrinth, slay the Minotaur, and escape the island. King Minos was furious, not only at the loss of the Minotaur, but at the realization that his supposedly perfect prison had been defeated. In his rage, Minos blamed Daedalus for the labyrinth's failure. How else could Theseus have succeeded unless the maze's creator had somehow betrayed its secrets? The accusation was unjust. Daedalus had no involvement in Theseus's success, but justice was not something King Minos was particularly concerned with when he was angry. As punishment, Minos imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus in a tower on a small island off the coast of Crete. The tower was tall and isolated, surrounded by water on all sides with no boats available and no way to swim to safety. The king assumed that even the great inventor Daedalus would be unable to escape such a prison. For several weeks, father and son lived in their tower cell, eating the simple food brought to them once a day, and watching the sunrise.